The Dark Phoenix Saga, a classic comic book storyline that turned 40 years old this year. Last year, it was adapted into a film that recently came out on HBO. This is going to be an in-depth analysis on both versions where I compared the two. But first, let's talk about the backstory of this movie. The story was adapted before in X-Men The Last Stand as a subplot. Now, many people believe that was the writer's choice, but doing a little bit of research will tell you that was Fox's call.
Just, to answer your question before about Phoenix, one of the things you have to understand is the studio did not want to do Phoenix, period. And I'm talking last, February, 5 months before the movie began, they were like, no, we're not going to do Phoenix. We're going to do Magneto versus the X-Men. That's what this movie is going to be about. And by the way, The Cure hadn't even really come up at that point. And so partly what we had been doing was arguing. We spent about 3 months just saying, no, we have to do Phoenix. We can't not do this story. We can't take this play. That's what the first two movies set up. So those were the arguments. It wasn't even about how are we going to do it?
So is there anything else you want to talk about once you did get approval? And yes, Entertainment Weekly said in their article, I think 5 things you need to know about X-Men a couple weeks before your release, that Dark Phoenix Saga is not in the movie. That was one of the big things that was listed in Entertainment Weekly.
It's interesting.
So I know that Fox was...
Yeah, they
weren't behind that element, but what else was it that was going through your minds on that saga that maybe didn't make it to the screen, if you want to tell us really briefly, because it's so hard to adapt?
Oh, what didn't make it to the screen?
Well, yeah, just something in your concept, in a broader scope, that maybe you really wanted, but because you had to also have the Cure element, there wasn't time or room for it.
Well, I don't think it's time or room. I think that we lost, to be quite frank. If you see the first half of the movie, we won every fight. And if you see the second half of the movie, we did not win every fight.
Well, the second half of the movie, I don't think Famke speaks out loud.
Yeah, and that was not our intention, and it was not our choice, and it was not the way it was written, and, that's life in the big city. So,
There is concept art from X3 of Jean destroying the Golden Gate Bridge, so they definitely wanted to do more with her. Now, why did they have Magneto do that instead? Well, it appears that Fox didn't want female-focused superhero movies after Elektra tanked, based on what producer Lauren Donner said. And Elektra was released while X3 was in development. Yeah, Fox definitely did not want that Phoenix story. Chris Claremont, who is the writer of the original storyline, had confirmed this. He was very close to the movie. He had a cameo in it and wrote the novelization for the film. So it's safe to say that he knows what he is talking about, and he did not like how the story was handled there.
Talk about that, because you've now seen 2 different renditions of the famous saga.
Well, Jean certainly had more to do in this X-Men than she did the first time. What can we do with you in Dark Phoenix? I'll just stand around and watch. First I'll sort of eat Scott off panel, and then I'll lie there, then I'll throw Wolverine through a wall, then I'll break the wall. She's breaking the 4th wall, you understand. And then I'll just stand around while Magneto tells me something. Then Wolverine will kill me, and that'll be the end of it. Wow. This is Dark Phoenix? Yeah. Well, that didn't work.
So X3 co-writer Simon Kinberg acted as writer, director, and producer of this movie, wanting to tell the story that the studio didn't let him and Zach Pym tell the last time.
The characterization of Phoenix, not necessarily how it manifests in the second half of the movie, but her characterization is something that's very close to our imagining of it. It was really like, this is a woman who is pure id, who is schizophrenic.
There's a movie from the early 90s called Clean Shaven by Lodge Kerrigan that I have to credit. It's about a guy who's schizophrenic.
They did Deadpool's origin story twice, so why not? But like the Gambit movie, it wasn't meant to be. I'll start by summarizing the original storyline, which parallels the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In Phoenix the Untold Story, the creators actually mentioned wanting to do this Jekyll and Hyde type thing with Jean. Now, the story of Jekyll and Hyde is viewed by many to be a metaphor of the nature of drug use and multiple personality disorder. It involves Henry Jekyll, who created a drug that unleashed the repressed dark side of his personality, which reflects how drugs lower people's inhibitions. In this state, Jekyll develops an alter ego called Edward Hyde and commits violent acts. But being Hyde makes him feel so great that he becomes addicted to the drug and keeps on taking it. However, Jekyll starts to turn into his alter ego uncontrollably without the drug, which resembles symptoms of multiple personality disorder. And Hyde grew stronger and stronger until Jekyll committed suicide to prevent his dark side from permanently taking over. Now let's look at the Phoenix story. It begins with Jean Grey on a space shuttle, being consumed by the radiation of a solar flare. There, she becomes one with a primal universal force and unlocks the full potential of her mutant abilities, granting her godlike power. Jean described her new cosmic power to be like a drug because she was in ecstasy whenever she used it. It was said to be the ultimate physical and emotional stimulant. And like Dr. Jekyll's drug, it made Jean's personality wilder and less under control whenever she used it. And this alter ego was called the Phoenix. The name was a reference to how she died on a space shuttle and reformed herself like the mythical Phoenix. I know about the retcons that came years later, but the movie is going with the original interpretation.
Did you hear what the kids are calling it?
Do I want to know?
Yeah. Phoenix. It's cool, right? No? Bird that rises from the dead.
The Dark Phoenix saga is where the Hellfire Club first appeared. They were the villains in X-Men First Class. They wanted to use Jean's power for their own gain. So, they tried to manipulate her into being their Black Queen. They did this by having this guy named Mastermind project illusions into Jean's mind that fulfilled her repressed dark desires. He frees the negative part of Jean, and it grows stronger and stronger. She slowly becomes consumed by her dark side. Jean starts to become more aggressive and misuses her powers. She eventually becomes the Black Queen, but quickly realizes that it's all a ruse and helps the X-Men defeat the Hellfire Club. However, it's too late, as Jean's Phoenix self takes over, becoming the Dark Phoenix. She flies off into space and absorbs the energy of a star because she's addicted to her power and wants more of it. That causes the star to go supernova and destroy the home world of the Dabari, who are allies of the Shi'ar Empire led by Empress Lilandra. Lilandra tries to execute Jean for her crimes, and the X-Men fight the Shi'ar to protect her. But like Dr. Jekyll, Jean's story ends with her committing suicide to keep her dark side from taking over. And that's the end of the summary. So this story is called a saga for a reason. Jean's transformation into the Dark Phoenix was a character arc that was built up over the course of 34 issues. And the filmmakers wanted this to be a saga as well. Back in 2017, Olivia Munn said this was supposed to be a two-parter. And Deadline Hollywood had also confirmed this, stating that Fox had canceled the second movie and Simon Kinberg had to make rewrites to the first movie. Chris Claremont also confirmed this. He had a cameo in this movie as well.
Simon Kinberg was, I think he started with a vision 5 years ago of what he wanted to do with this film, not the least of which was his coming to Fox and saying, I see this as a two-part film. The first part would be Phoenix, the second part would be Dark Phoenix.
Based on concept art, the first film would have featured the return of Emma Frost with a new Hellfire Club. And the second film would have focused on the cosmic aspect of the storyline featuring the Shi'ar, as Greg Butler suggested in an IO9 interview. He was the visual effects supervisor of the film. There he says that the over-the-top cosmic part of Phoenix belongs in the second part of a two-film story. Back in 2017, Deadline Hollywood had reported that Jessica Chastain had signed up to play Empress Lilandra.
Always like every day kind of trying to figure out, who am I? You know, the mystery of who is this character? And then understanding that also with the reshoots, you kind of go, oh, it's changing again. You know what I mean? It was like a constant evolution.
Before the movie came out, there were interviews stating that Jean's power was like a drug. It made her feel good whenever she used it. You know, like in the comic. There's even a clip in the trailers where she says it.
When I lose control, bad things happen. But it feels good.
That was unfortunately cut from the final film, along with other essential scenes. That's why the movie's so short and feels so rushed. And that appears to be Fox's doing rather than the filmmakers. Because back in October of 2018, Simon Kimber said the movie will be over 2 hours long.
And how long do you think the movie actually will end up being?
Gosh, man. I would say it has always lived within the 2 hours to 2 hours plus universe. It's never been a 2.5 hour movie. It's never been under a 2 hour movie. It's always lived in the 2 hour and 5 minute to 2 hour and 20 minute kind of world.
Completely.
Chris Claremont hinted at this being the case, stating that telling the story with that short runtime is a challenge, while mentioning that there were outside interference from companies, which he won't name. He also feels that Simon Kimber tried his best with many things out of his control. He considers it a good movie and better than The Last Stand.
I also wanted to ask you, was there anything from the comics that you would have liked to include but just couldn't for any reason?
Well, I think if I had like 4 hours to tell this story, I would have included the Hellfire Club. I might have included Lilandra.
Now that the backstory is out of the way, let's begin analyzing this movie. I'll start by saying that many people believe that this film immediately makes Jean the Dark Phoenix, like X-Men The Last Stand did.
Just like in The Last Stand, they rush to make her the Phoenix. They forget about Jean Grey the person, and then just show her suffering, and that and she's like hyper attuned to pain, emotion, her sexual desires. That was also in The Last Stand. Yeah. There's a little bit of it in Dark Phoenix. And then she just becomes the villain, right? Who the X-Men don't want to hurt, but they want to save, but she's going to hurt them anyways.
Not really. The worst she does is kill Mystique, and that was totally an accident. And she showed remorse for that. When she killed people as Dark Phoenix in the comic, she did so without any remorse or regret. Now, she did accidentally, quote unquote, killed X-Men and showed remorse. But that was during the build-up before she became the Dark Phoenix. And that's my point. Despite what the marketing campaign will have you believe, Jean is not supposed to be a villain. It's even stated in the behind-the-scenes features.
The thing about Jean Grey is that she's not a villain, but she's not like a superhero, gonna save the world, everything is fine.
Because she was going to be a villain in the sequel, which is now cancelled. Remember, this was planned as a two-parter.
The first part would be Phoenix, the second part would be Dark Phoenix.
Very recently, I reread Uncanny X-Men issues 100 through 138. This movie is based on the issues before Jean became the Dark Phoenix. It's very clear that this is a reworked version of the first film that replaces the Hellfire Club with random aliens. I think Fox just wanted to be the first to use the Skrulls. They probably heard that Captain Marvel was going to use them. You see, Juggernaut was supposed to appear in X-Men Days of Future Past, but then he was replaced with Quicksilver after it was announced that the character would appear in Age of Ultron. So changes like this have happened before in the past.
Trying to, pull as much as I could from the source material, knowing that I couldn't bring everything. I didn't bring the Hellfire Club. I didn't bring Lilandra.
The aliens want to kill off humanity and take over the world, just like the Hellfire Club in X-Men First Class. They have a fancy mansion, just like the Hellfire Club did in the comic. They are led by a blonde-haired woman with psychic powers, who was clearly Emma Frost in an earlier version of the script. According to Simon Kimber, she is supposed to play the mastermind role, just like Emma Frost did in the original plan for X-Men 3. Like I said, they were trying to tell the story Fox didn't let them tell the last time. The film also adapts elements of Jean's pre-Phoenix days, taking inspiration from Bizarre Adventures issue 27 and X-Men Origins Jean Grey, both of which show Jean's origin, of course. Here's a brief summary. When Jean was a child, she witnessed her friend Annie Richardson get fatally injured in a car accident. The event dramatizes her, and that causes her powers to activate. And her telepathy causes her to feel everything Annie is feeling as she dies. She then develops post-traumatic stress disorder, having vivid flashbacks of the traumatic experience over and over again. The drama was also causing Jean's telepathy to go out of control. She couldn't shut it off and would become overwhelmed by the thoughts of others. And so she had distanced herself from other people. One time she did get overwhelmed and used her telekinesis to lash out at people to make the voices stop. Then Charles Xavier comes to help Jean with her powers and her mental condition. Her father asks him to take away his daughter's powers or erase her memory of the dramatic experience. But Charles refuses, believing that Jean's powers are a gift. Instead, he chooses to suppress her telepathy, but only temporarily until Jean learns to cope with the drama. And eventually, Charles does succeed in helping Jean heal. Now let's compare that to Jean's backstory shown in the film. It is stated that she was dramatized as a child, like her comic book counterpart, which Charles Xavier had repressed.
Mind of a psychic is a fragile thing. Takes only the slightest tap to tip it in the wrong direction. I had to make adjustments to her mind when she was young. Scaffolding. Walls, rather. To keep out all the trauma.
And that repressed part of Jean is unleashed when the Force enters her body. And as a result, Jean's buried emotions within her start coming out all at once.
I think that whatever happened in space did something to her. In the process, those walls that I erected are being torn down. She's all desire, all rage, all pain. And it's all coming out at once.
It's your fault she's dead. And I'll talk about fair. You messed with the mind of an 8-year-old girl. You pushed down all that pain and anger. Where do you think it's gonna go?
Anger is a very common reaction to psychological drama. It can lead to uncontrollable fits of rage. Here are some real-life examples.
My kids would ask me for something simple. Can I have a snack? No! Leave me alone. I drove them away.
I guess he put out enough that he didn't want to be bothered, so the kids knew that, and they stayed away from him. So he kind of faded into the background.
But in a small house, there's not much background when Dad is so quick to anger.
Maybe playing with a toy, and it'd be something that beeps or blinks or something, and the third time I told them, stop that. Gimme. Problem solved. Go away.
Me personally, I have right now a lot of anger issues, and I go to a bar intending on finding someone. It doesn't matter what they say or do. If they gave my friend an ugly look, I'd go up to him or something, or just wait for something to happen, and I'd want it to happen, and then that was never me.
Jean displays other emotional symptoms of being dramatized in the film, like anxiety and fear, guilt, shame, self-blame, withdrawing from others, and feeling sad and hopeless, along with other psychological symptoms.
When she did go through a phase of this psychosis, we tried to psychologically with the camera move into that comfort space.
The symptoms that Jean is having, they're not unlike schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder.
This dissociative identity disorder is another term for multiple personality disorder. It's a common reaction to severe drama during childhood. Back in 2018, Sophie Turner said that this movie is about Jean struggling with her mental health, like in her origin. According to Simon Kinberg, it's Jean's drama that's making her powers go out of control. And like in X-Men Origins Jean Grey, she lashes out at people to make the voices stop. That is another reason why the argument that they rushed to make Jean the Dark Phoenix is invalid, because that's an element from her origin story, and you wouldn't say that Jean was a villain when she was a child, now would you? Of course you wouldn't. That would be silly. Now, there are changes to her origin, where instead of being dramatized by the death of a friend, it's accidentally causing the death of her mother that dramatizes her. Still kept it as a car accident. She had also felt her mother dying, like with Annie in the comic.
And then one day, I was coming home from school with my mom, and I got in her head. She lost control of the car, crashed into a tree. I could feel everything she felt in that moment of her death. I could
And instead of suppressing Jean's powers, Charles does the complete opposite of his comic book counterpart and suppresses her memories. He's already tried the other option.
A series of psychic barriers to isolate her powers from her conscious mind. And as a result, Jean developed a dual personality. A personality that in our sessions came to call itself the Phoenix.
As Wolverine had showed him in Days of Future Past, Xavier was also responsible for the events of the Dark Phoenix saga in the comic version. In summary, this film is an adaptation of Jean's origin story, and the events that led to her becoming the Dark Phoenix, not when she was the Dark Phoenix. Instead of it being repressed fantasies that are being freed, it's negative emotions from repressed drama.
Story, if you go back and read it, is very Jekyll and Hyde. It's very much about a person whose id has been repressed, and then when that id comes out, it explodes.
And the Phoenix does appear to be the embodiment of Jean's repressed emotions in this movie, similar to how Mr. Hyde was for Dr. Jekyll. Now, back in 2017, Simon Kimber told Entertainment Magazine the premise of the movie, stating the cosmic energy had triggered, awakened, and created the Phoenix inside Jean, implying that it was a force that was already inside her. And it shows up whenever she is angry, representing that repressed rage inside her.
Answer the question, Jean.
Stop, Eric. You're making me angry.
Good. I want you to be angry. Show me what happens,
I don't want
Jean.
to hurt you.
What happens when you're angry?
And they did this to make Jean relatable. Her backstory in the comic is a struggle that many people have in real life. This is what the cast and crew said in an interview with Gilmore magazine. And some people did relate to her and her struggle. This movie is about fully establishing Jean, based on what Chris Claremont says here. So you would care when she is actually being the Dark Phoenix in the sequel that is now cancelled. We only really get a glimpse of Jean as the Dark Phoenix towards the end, where she flies off into space after she defeats the bad guys that tried to manipulate her. Doesn't that sound familiar?
This allows Jean to escape Mastermind's control and fry his brain, but it also causes Jean's psychic barriers to break. Jean Grey goes mad with power and becomes the Dark Phoenix. Jean nearly kills the other X-Men, then takes off into space and absorbs a star, destroying an inhabited planet in the process.
If this had a sequel, I would bet money that it would have opened with Jean eating a star. Now remember what Greg Butler said about the cosmic aspect of Phoenix belonging in the second part of a two-film story? It all makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
The first part would be Phoenix, the second part would be Dark Phoenix.
And then by the end of the film, her arc is basically, she's lost complete control.
So, no. No, they did not immediately make Jean the Dark Phoenix. It took the entire movie to get her to that point. Her transformation into the Dark Phoenix is treated as a character arc, like in the comic.
Each of the films that I feel like we've worked on are different from one another. You know, they all have a sort of subgenre within them. Logan was a Western. Deadpool was a zany comedy. The second Deadpool movie was a father-son dramedy. Days of Future Past was a time travel movie. X-Men First Class was a spy movie. Apocalypse was a disaster movie. Dark Phoenix was a character-driven psychological thriller.
And character-driven stories focus on studying the characters, dealing with their inner transformation. An example of this is Joker. That movie is about Arthur Fleck's transformation into the Joker. And he doesn't immediately become the clown prince of crime. Does he? Of course not. Because the focus is on showing how he got to that point. It's not until the end of the movie where we see him in that iconic look, with his new gang of criminals, and putting a smile on his face with his own blood, is when he becomes the Joker. And I bring Joker up to prove a point. You see, some people try to counter my argument by saying that since the movie is titled Dark Phoenix, that must mean Jean is supposed to be the Dark Phoenix for most of the movie. And I'm using Joker as a counterexample. Another counterexample is Batman Begins, Bruce Wayne does not become the Dark Knight until halfway through the movie, despite Batman being in the title. In fact, Simon Kinberg stated that he took inspiration from that film in that regard. In fact, I can use the source material of this movie as a counterexample. Jean did not become the Dark Phoenix until halfway through the storyline, and it was only for 2 issues. The characters in the story say that Jean's time as the Dark Phoenix was brief, so I don't know why anyone who has read the story would expect Jean to be the Dark Phoenix for most of the movie. A lot of criticisms of this movie truly baffle me, and I'm going to refute more of them in my next video where I break down the film's story structure. And if you don't know how the 3-act structure works, I recommend watching these videos that explain them. Till next time.